Coordinated vulnerability disclosure is a topic the IoT Security Foundation have discussed on many occasions in the past. We published a guide on this subject back in 2017, and we have been pushing the IoT industries to step up and implement vulnerability disclosure processes in their own companies. Well, the world has moved on and progress has been made in this direction. Firstly, the UK Government Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport released its Code of Practice for Consumer IoT Security, where it prioritised vulnerability disclosure as one of 3 essential measures which it expected to bring the largest security benefits in the short term. This initiative was pushed a step further by the ETSI standard EN 303645 Cybersecurity for Consumer Internet of Things, which specifically included the requirement to implement a means to manage reports of vulnerabilities. Now, many regulatory authorities around the world are adopting the standard, and the ISO have also updated their standards, ISO 29147 and 30111. The direction of travel is clear here. Fixing vulnerabilities in connected IoT products is a basic requirement. So we too at the IoTSF have just published version 2 of our vulnerability disclosure guide. So let's revisit what coordinated vulnerability disclosure is, why we need it, and then we'll take a short look at our new guide document. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure, or CVD, does now appear as a topic on the internet, and as is often the case, definitions vary. But my definition of CVD is as follows. It is a clearly defined end-to-end process for a finder of a product vulnerability to readily share information with the product manufacturer. The manufacturer follows an established process to address the vulnerability and release a solution in a managed fashion across the product user base and wider public. In some circumstances, value can be added to the overall process by the manufacturer working with the finder. Adding slightly more detail to that, there is a clear and effective process for how vulnerabilities are reported, for how reported vulnerabilities are addressed by the manufacturer, and how any resolution to the vulnerability is rolled out to the users and wider public. Thus, there is a clear and established end-to-end process for resolution of the vulnerability, with the possibility in some circumstances to add value to the process by coordinating with the finder. But why do we need coordinated vulnerability disclosure? The consequences of not fixing a vulnerability are many and varied, anything from negligible impact to disastrous. There could be some inconvenience to the user, maybe the lights don't work or they can't set their house alarm. There could be increased costs to the user, maybe the heating constantly runs too hot. Or financial losses to the user, perhaps the freezer is too warm and produce is wasted. Endangerment and risk of death. Perhaps a medical device takes inappropriate actions or traffic control signals cause vehicle collisions. And of course, disruption to local networks or the internet with botnets, denial of service attacks, etc. These are all some such examples. But the knock-on effect from these for the manufacturer could be reduction in future sales, class action against the manufacturer, reputational or brand damage, and impact on share value. If you consider the high street both inside and outside the consumer electronics world, big name brand survival is based upon products that are trustworthy, where customers get good service from the stores. Likewise, as time moves on, customers will increasingly buy IoT products from brands, i.e. manufacturers, they can trust, and where they know they'll be supported if things go awry. So there's every reason for manufacturers to properly support their products and customers to establish and maintain a professional stance in the industry. Having a coordinated vulnerability process goes a long way towards achieving this. In this final section, I would like to introduce our updated Vulnerability Disclosure Guide. Version 2 of our guide has been completely rewritten to reflect current thinking and best practice in this space. Also, since version 1 was published, 2 updated ISO documents have been published on the subject. ISO IEC 29147 describes vulnerability disclosure techniques and policies for vendors to receive vulnerability reports and publish remediation documentation. It should be used in conjunction with the other ISO document here, ISO IEC 30111. ISO 29147 goes into comprehensive detail about the requirements for an end-to-end CVD process and the interrelationship between the various stakeholders. ISO 30111 similarly identifies comprehensive requirements and recommendations for how a vendor should process and remediate reported potential vulnerabilities in one of their products or services. These 2 excellent international standards can be purchased via the usual channels. Returning now to our own guide, as with our other best practice guides, version 2 of the IoTSF's vulnerability disclosure document is free to download from our website. The content is broadly similar to the 2 aforementioned ISO documents, which is indicative of the singular industry recognized approach to managing vulnerabilities. In fact, in later drafts, we align terminology with that used in the ISO standards to avoid confusion and create consistency for the readership. Our document provides discussion and guidance on a number of topics, including creation of a vulnerability disclosure policy, establishing a suitable mechanism for receiving vulnerability reports, communicating with the reporter of the vulnerability, where reporter is the terminology used throughout the documentation, managing the report itself internally, investigation and handling of the reported issue, engaging with the reporter, and publishing of the subsequent advisory notice. I'm not going to go into the detail of these topics here. I'll leave you to read that for yourself. But here is the high-level flow of actions involved in CVD. I will, though, just pick up on 2 or 3 points to take away. Central to the whole CVD process is the Vulnerability Disclosure Policy. This policy is developed by the manufacturer themselves, although hereafter I shall refer to them as the generic term vendor as used throughout the documentation. The policy sets out at a high level how the vendor will manage vulnerability reports end to end. It summarises the processes, process owner roles, reporting structure, method for reporting vulnerabilities, how reporters are to be engaged, and the company's stance on bug bounties. This is all explained in our guide. Once the vulnerability disclosure policy is defined, it acts as a set of requirements, and the whole disclosure mechanism, as summarized in this diagram, can be built around that. Another crucial part of the CVD solution is providing a ready means by which reporters of vulnerabilities can contact the vendor. Particularly in big corporate companies, it is often very difficult to identify whereabouts and how one can report a vulnerability. If a reporter struggles to make contact with the vendor, they'll either give up and leave an unreported vulnerability out in the wild, else they'll reveal the vulnerability elsewhere, which could be, shall we say, less than ideal for the vendor, let alone anyone else. The final point I would like to briefly touch on before closing is coordinated engagement with the reporter of the vulnerability. Potentially anyone could report a vulnerability, but most reports are likely to be from a researcher of some kind, be it a curious hobbyist or perhaps a security tech company. Whoever it is, they have a reason for submitting the report. It could be they are just curious tinkerers like our hobbyist and thought they ought to report a finding. It may be they want to do the right thing and help keep the world safe. The reporter could be hoping for a financial reward or bug bounty, or perhaps they want to raise their professional profile within the industry. Or maybe they have strong ideological views and principles and are trying to make a statement. Their reasons are varied, as will be their technical skills, but reporters give the potential for fruitful engagement. Yes, situations vary considerably case by case, but vendors should proactively manage their relationship with the reporter. A disgruntled reporter can significantly undermine the vendor's handling of a reported vulnerability, but conversely, a well-engaged reporter could add real value to the process. So that's it, we've reached the end. Version 2 of our Vulnerability Disclosure Guide is free to download from the IoTSF website now, as are many other useful best practice guides. Thank you for listening.